Donald Trump said in 2020 if he lost Minnesota, he would never come back here.
Well, we've done for Minnesota. I lose Minnesota, I'm never coming back. I don't care. I'm never coming back.
He did lose the state, but he is coming back this week. New internal Republican polling reportedly shows Trump could win Minnesota in 2024.
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. Donald Trump is coming back to town for the Minnesota GOP's biggest fundraiser, the Lincoln Reagan Dinner in St. Paul. Republicans believe Trump has a shot of winning Minnesota. Why? Why does this matter? Because this national presidential election is expected to be very, very close. And Minnesota's 10 electoral college votes could be critical. A win here could offset a loss in another state, especially Wisconsin, which also has 10 electoral college votes and is up for grabs. Minnesota has not voted for a Republican presidential candidate since Richard Nixon carried the state in 1972. But in 2016, Trump almost pulled off a shocking upset here, losing to Hillary Clinton by less than 2 percentage points. But in 2020, President Biden beat Trump here by 7 percentage points. Tonight, you'll hear from 4 different political analysts who agree that Minnesota is up for grabs and that right now, former President Donald Trump is ahead, but not by much. Let's start with Humphrey School professor Larry Jacobs. Joining us right now is Professor Larry Jacobs of the Humphrey School. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's great to be with you.
All right. President Trump said he wouldn't come back if he lost. He's coming back.
He's coming back, but 2024 is going to be very different, I think, than 2020. In 2020, the focus was Donald Trump as the incumbent. We had COVID. The economy was suffering. Now it's Joe Biden's turn as the incumbent, and we are just seeing a whole lot of hurt in America in terms of the economy, inflation. Joe Biden has got terrible approval ratings for his handling of those things. Plus, you got 2/3 of Americans saying we're heading in the wrong direction. So it is a bad environment for the incumbent. And so I think, this is going to help the challenger, Donald Trump, this time.
Well, Minnesota, of course, the state that hasn't voted for a Republican candidate for president since 1972. Richard Nixon, I feel like there are fewer people that were alive when Richard Nixon was president. I remember it. I was young, but Can Donald Trump really win Minnesota?
Yes.
Is that what this is about, him coming here?
Yes, I think Donald Trump can win in Minnesota. He came within 2 points in 2016, and honestly, he didn't really put in a whole lot of effort. And so he feels very strongly that he can win in 2024. The polls show the state to be statistically a toss-up, and he sees Donald Trump as having the momentum, and Joe Biden really struggling with getting the vote out among some of his core constituents. We saw in the primary, there was a very large number of folks who just said they were uncommitted in the Democratic primary. So a lot of bad news for Joe Biden.
Let me ask you about the uncommitted vote, which of course was a protest against the Israel-Hamas war. Biden is trying to split the baby here. It seems like he's saying that he doesn't want any more U.S. arms to go to offensive in Hamas, specifically in Rafah. But he's also saying he is still the supporter of Israel. I mean, is he just making enemies from both sides? I mean, is that a winning strategy?
I think if Joe Biden is heading into November's election, where he's still got a hot war in Gaza, he's in real trouble because he's going to find that his core supporters in the Democratic Party, younger Americans, may well just sit out the election. We've also seen that Arab Americans, Muslim Americans have expressed a very strong view that they are not going to support Joe Biden if they see him continuing to support the kind of violence going on in Gaza. Remember, in a state like Michigan and in Minnesota, the winning margin could well be those Muslim and American Arabs.
Right. In terms of these legal cases, the one that obviously is going on now is pretty salacious. Porn star, hush money, the kinds of sex that they had, a lot of details that I think a lot of people feel is too much information. Yet it doesn't seem to be making a dent in his support.
Well, I think the supporters of Donald Trump support him. And that support is about as ironclad as you'll ever see in politics. But I think there are a lot of voters who haven't really checked out this election. They're not really focused on the election. And at this point, a lot of those details, it's kind of just confusion and background noise. If Donald Trump is elected, though, and this carries on into the November election, I do think it'll hurt him, not with a large number of voters, but maybe with just enough so that Joe Biden can win narrowly in states like Minnesota and battleground states.
All right. And further down ballot, obviously, you've got Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's a prohibitive favorite to win re-election. Further down ballot, though, you've got these legislative races, and I think people will probably get it after what happened last year in the legislature when they had this really transformative year and voted all of these policies in. How do you think that's going to go? Because there are very narrow margins in both houses, in the Minnesota Senate and in the Minnesota House.
The Minnesota House is up for election in 2024, and I've spent some time looking at those close races. And it's interesting where we saw those uncommitted votes, a protest vote against Joe Biden, are in some of those very close races that Democrats won. To me, that is a signal that if Joe Biden performs poorly in Minnesota, sees a drop in turnout among Democratic voters, it could really hurt the Democrats running in the Minnesota House. We could well see the trifecta in Minnesota shattered, with Republicans taking the majority, perhaps narrowly, in the Minnesota House.
All right. Well, Larry Jacobs, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Good to join you.
Well, joining us right now, DFL analyst Abou Amara. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right. Donald Trump said he'd never come back here. If he lost the state, he lost the state, and he's coming back. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think he's coming back because he knows his path ultimately runs through that blue wall in the upper Midwest. It's Pennsylvania, it's Michigan, it's Wisconsin, and yes, it is also Minnesota. And I think there's really two reasons. One, Donald Trump sees an opportunity. There's a bit of consternation within the Democratic Party around the war in Gaza that's really impacting voters in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so I think you're seeing Donald Trump come here. And the second piece is this. Donald Trump didn't lose Minnesota by that much in 2016. And so, as a Democratic operative, I'm concerned that if we don't do what we have to do, there's an opportunity for him to win in Wisconsin and ultimately in Minnesota.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was a shocker for the Democrats in 2016 when he almost won Minnesota. In fact, they didn't call Minnesota, I think, until the next day.
That's right.
That close. But in 2020, he lost by 7 points. Minnesota's never gone Democrat, hasn't gone Democratic since 1972, when the state voted for Richard Nixon, of which many of our viewers weren't even born. Do you really think, and do Democrats really believe that Trump has a chance? Because that would be quite something if he could pull that off.
Look, I'm not saying he's the favorite in Minnesota, but Donald Trump understands he has to grow the map, right? Because of who he is, a lot of it's baked into the cake. So he's got states like North Carolina that are going to go with him pretty much no matter what. States like Nevada that are probably going to go with him. He's got to expand the electorate and expand the map if he wants a path at winning. And Minnesota is one of those states that, structurally speaking, looks like a Michigan, looks like a Pennsylvania, looks like a Wisconsin. And if he's competitive in those states, he's thinking maybe I can push the map a little bit further west and hopefully try to grab Minnesota.
All right. And he did say that in the 2020 campaign, that Minnesota was the state that got away from him. He said that repeatedly because he came here repeatedly in an effort to win it. In terms of the overall Democratic Party, is there concern that the lack of enthusiasm for Joe Biden at the top, and I'm talking about people's inability, when I talk to voters, of being able to say what Biden has done good for them, is there a concern that that's going to drag people down ballot?
Well, I'll tell you, there is a concern that the president hasn't been campaigning enough across the country this early. I think that's a legitimate critique. I will say two things. One, the Democratic Party in Minnesota, from an infrastructure standpoint, is far more sophisticated than the state Republican Party. And I think that's going to help Democrats as we get closer to Election Day. The second piece is going to be Senator Klobuchar. She's going to play an instrumental role in reminding voters What is at issue in this election? Remember, she's going to also be on the ticket. And we know Amy Klobuchar has broad appeal across the state. So I suspect probably after Labor Day, you're going to see Democrats get into overdrive, really trying to drag out voters. Because if we don't do that, I think right now we're at a disadvantage. But as we get closer to Election Day, I think we can close that gap.
All right. Right now we're in the middle of this hush money trial. It's certainly salacious and sexy and messy and kind of really unappealing when you hear all the details. You don't want to hear the details. Yet it's possible that that's not really what he's being charged with. It's a very complicated case. If in fact he ends up being convicted, do you think people are going to hold it against him? It doesn't sound like his supporters will.
Yeah, I think the conviction really tells us two things, right? It tells us his base is pretty much with him no matter what. I mean, he said in 2016 he could be on Fifth Avenue, shoot someone and get away with it. With those voters, that pretty much is true. I think there's a small sliver of folks, if you look in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, if you look at the suburbs of Phoenix, and the polling indicates is that those folks potentially could move based on a conviction. So does it impact them in Minnesota or the blue wall? No. But in a couple of those swing states, it might actually impact him.
And why is Trump making inroads this year with blacks and Latinos?
Yeah, to me, this is one of the million-dollar questions that the Democratic Party is going to have to do, win or lose, in a post-mortem to really understand. My operating theory right now is this. You have communities who've historically been marginalized in the political space. On top of that, economically, inflation is really a really important issue. It's something people experience every day at the grocery store, at the gas pump. And so you can talk about, high macroeconomic indicators, but people really judge what's going on in their life based on the kitchen table and based on their pocketbook. And I think they're feeling some pain there. And that's an opportunity for Donald Trump to say, remember the good times of yesteryear.
Right. And I think absolutely. I think that's definitely true. Things are still more expensive than they were before the pandemic, which seems like it was 25 years ago. Anyway, Abou Amara, thank you so much. We always appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
Joining us right now is Republican analyst Amy Koch, former Senate Majority Leader. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Donald Trump said he'd never be back. He's back.
Yeah, he's back.
Last time, what's going on?
Well, ever since 2016, when former President Trump, in 16, he lost Minnesota, but he lost by 1 point. And Minnesota has not gone for a Republican president since Richard Nixon. And so I think, in 2018, I ran a statewide U.S. Senate race, and we looked at those numbers. Now, the truth is, it wasn't so much Trump. Trump actually, he did not much better than Romney. He did a little better than Romney, and the votes were kind of moved around. Like, for example, people can think this, the Iron Range was much heavier for Trump than Romney, but the suburbs were lighter for Trump than Romney. His numbers, though, were pretty same. Hillary tremendously underperformed. That's what happened. But still, Donald Trump came within 1 point, closer than any Republican president in decades, my whole lifetime. And so that has always stuck with him. We would hear from the White House in 2018 that he wanted to get back to Minnesota. He always felt like if he had come there a few more times, he could have done something.
Well, he said that campaigning on the campaign trail in Duluth, yes, here in Minneapolis. There was a bunch of times that I covered him where he said that this is if I'd only done one more rally in 2016, yes, I would have won.
He did one rally at the last Monday or Sunday or something. I went to it. I've been to 4 Trump rallies in Minnesota, and he did just that one. And the turnout that day was like nothing I've ever seen. I remember going and thinking, I've never seen a political event like this. I've been to other presidential events. The line was out the door, the overfill. People were parking on 94 just to climb the fence to get in. I
saw that.
It was the most crazy rally I've ever seen.
I saw that too.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
What do you think? I mean, do you think he has a shot at winning Minnesota?
Here's what I think. I do think that President Biden, again, and I don't know if it's a case of does he win Minnesota or does President Biden lose Minnesota? Because his numbers are flagging. Certainly they're neck and neck. And I just feel like the momentum, the excitement, the I'm voting for the person is on former President Trump's side versus on President Biden's side where it's like, well, I don't want Trump, or, well, I have to do this because if I don't vote or I vote third party, that's a vote for Trump, right? Like there's just the enthusiasm is completely not there for the current president.
How about Republican women that you talked to?
Yeah.
Is there not discomfort with the allegations against him, ranging from Stormy Daniels to the rape allegations that were pursued by that writer in New York? What gives?
100%. And I think that's the large, like what we saw in 22, which was when Republicans were supposed to win everything, and then they didn't. There was this very quiet vote, particularly because of the Supreme Court decision that took place in June of 22. And of course, that can be directly linked to Supreme Court nominees put in place by former President Trump. Like there's no doubt about it. He's taking credit for it, and Joe Biden is placing blame on him. And so will those same, frankly, mostly women, and particularly in the suburbs, will they come out and vote in those same numbers on the same issue? I think that is a question that if that happens, and there's still a very large Nikki Haley vote that's happening in primaries across the country that happened here in Minnesota. If those Republicans do not come home, then that I think is a plus in the column for President Biden.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy Koch, as always.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Esme.
Well, joining us right now is Professor David Schultz, who's actually joining us from Romania. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
All right, let me ask you your thoughts on Trump's legal problems, this trial, and why it doesn't seem to be hurting him in the polls.
Okay, so first, let's start with his legal problems. Is that he has his first case going on in New York, and what's happening at this point is that his former attorney, Cohen, has, in his testimony, significantly connected Donald Trump to the scheme for making payoffs or payments to Stormy Daniels. Now, obviously, we don't know what the outcome of the trial is going to be at this point. But the reason why this trial is significant, it's probably the only trial Trump will face before the election. And there's pretty good polling data that suggests that if he were convicted, about 50% of the swing voters said they would be less likely to vote for him. So in a very close election, those 50% swing voters could have a huge, huge impact.
Without getting into all the technicalities, this trial is actually not about the hush money. It's about the concealing and manipulation of documents, the federal documents. Isn't that something that's never been proved before, or it's never been used before in a court of law? Is that going to work? Are they stretching too much in this case?
Well, clearly it's a stretch, because you're correct here that per se making hush money payments may not necessarily be illegal. And even if they are, normally in New York State, what he would have been charged with would have been routine misdemeanor business fraud. But because the argument is being made by the prosecutors, he was trying to make these payments and hide these payments for the purposes of trying to make sure that release of the Stormy Daniels story wouldn't affect the election. What he's being charged with then is a felony fraud, charged with the argument that says that you are making false business entries for the purposes of trying to conceal another crime, that is, improperly influence an election. That's the legal hook. That's the legal hook to get it up to a felony. This has never been done before in terms of using election law for that purposes. It's been used in other situations, but not with election law. So this is a really unique case that's being brought by the Manhattan Borough and its New York City prosecutors.
So even if Trump loses, there obviously will be an appeal. That appeal could take us past the election, couldn't it?
There's no question about it. The question becomes sort of two issues here. One, there's sort of, I'm going to call it the trial impact in terms of guilt or innocence. And then the second is obviously going to be what? The court of public opinion. And go back to what I mentioned a minute ago here. if he is initially convicted of a crime, you're right. An appeal probably will not occur until after the election, which means if he were convicted, he goes into the election, having violated a law, having committed potentially a felony. That could be the impact on the election that I think Donald Trump is very much worried about.
Right, although it would be under appeal. Let me ask you quickly, do you think he has a shot in Minnesota? Apparently there are polls, internal polls, that show he's very close.
I think he does at this point. Is that, remember, in 2016, he got very close in terms of almost winning, almost just barely losing to Hillary Clinton by 50,000 votes. Joe Biden did much better against him. But the point is that Donald Trump showed up, he campaigned, and Hillary Clinton didn't defend the state, and it almost cost her. For Trump right now, even if he does not really have a chance of winning the state, the fact that he's going to make Joe Biden campaign here means that for every dollar Joe Biden spends here, every minute he spends here, it's time Joe Biden can't spend another swing state. It's a very smart strategy. So on one level, it's simply about expanding the competition, but also there are so many parallels between the demographics of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan in terms of percentage of white working class voters, in terms of percentage of voters who are supportive of Donald Trump, at least on the surface, that it's not inconceivable with the right campaign that he could win the state.
All right. Well, Professor David Schultz, teaching in Romania and Eastern Europe, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Esme. Thank you for having me.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, please email me with comments and suggestions at esme@cbs.com. The show streams every Wednesday and Thursday night at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. And on Fridays, it posts to YouTube for on-demand viewing. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.